Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our latest session of Decoding China. I'm Kristen Gomez, Communications Director at the Paulson Institute, and we are going to kick off another great session. I'm just here to give you a few housekeeping items. One is that we are going to put in the chat feed the link to where you can find Cheng Li's book. And also, please feel free to ask questions because we're going to have a great Q&A session during the last 15 minutes of the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Damien Ma, head of our MacroPolo think tank, and Cheng Li. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And Cheng, it's great to be with you. I'm delighted to be talking to you about your latest work. We obviously haven't seen each other in quite some time, and there's plenty to catch up on outside of your book. But today we want to focus on your latest piece of work, which is Middle Class Shanghai. And I had a chance to already read it, and I think it's so full and rich of just amazing material, and really is quite an interesting case study, I guess, about how Shanghai can serve as a microcosm for China's future. And that's sort of the main question that we're going to kind of get around to throughout this talk. So I want to kind of have this talk in kind of three sections. One is start with the microcosm, Shanghai, and then expand to what this book really is about, I think, is about the middle class and how it's shaping China. So that's kind of the second level. And lastly, we should talk a little bit about how U.S. policy should think about the growth and the changes in the Chinese middle class as a major constituency. So let's start with the smallest part, which is Shanghai. The obvious question is, why Shanghai? What attributes make Shanghai a good case study to illustrate China's future?
Thank you, Damien, for that generous introduction. Also, thank you to my good friend, Deborah Lear, and the Paulson Institute for the kind invitation. Please allow me to take this opportunity to express my profound appreciation or admiration and for the great work that the Paulson Institute has accomplished over the past decade. I realize this is the 10th anniversary, if I get things right. Now, like many others, I have greatly benefited from your groundbreaking programs that have promoted both resilient and a sustainable world with low carbon growth and a deeper understanding across the Pacific, including, Damien, your excellent data-driven project, think tank, MacroPolo, which was very helpful as I completed my book. I cited in the book. I don't know whether you noticed or not. And I'm truly honored and humbled to speak to your distinguished audience. And I look forward to exchanging ideas and views with you and with others this hour. Now, for your question, why Shanghai? And I'm glad that you started with this essential question, why Shanghai? There are a number of reasons that I have to focus on Shanghai. Let me mention three of them. First, Shanghai is the cradle of both the middle class and the foreign educated returnees. The Chinese call them sea turtles, as you know. The two groups I have examined extensively in the book. About 10 years ago, when I decided to write this book, actually this whole book project started 10 years ago, 40% of the emerging Chinese middle class lived in Shanghai and the three other major cities, Beijing, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. And also about 25% of foreign educated returnees work in Shanghai alone. So these two things certainly made me to choose Shanghai, which is most important in terms of observe the rise of middle class and the rise of foreign educated returnees. Now, secondly, I'm intrigued with the multiple identities of Shanghai, namely local, national, and the cosmopolitan identities. They are all dynamic, mutually reinforcing each other, while also retaining independent values within particular context. Now, Shanghai's culture and the culture dynamics across really emphasize neither culture clash or civilization clash, nor cultural convergence, but rather they emphasize cultural coexistence and cultural diversity. Now, this observation or argument reflects the overall theme of the book. Shanghai is not a monolithic entity, not to mention China as a whole. Unfortunately, the ongoing policy and the political discourse on China in the United States today disproportionately focus on Beijing, on the Chinese authoritarian system, and on the so-called China threat, often treating the most populous country in the world in a monolithic way. A study of Shanghai, and especially its dynamic middle class, I hope, can challenge this narrative and broaden our perspectives and our policy choices. Now, this leads me to the third and probably most important reason why Shanghai. Shanghai is currently the pace setter in China's new search for global power, and its role will shape how China will act and how the outside world will respond to the emergence of a global China. But here, I want to address my argument that the middle class Shanghai actually reveals China's unsettled future, because Shanghai embodies what I call two tales of a city. Let me very quickly to mention that in my view, Shanghai was, is, and will be paradoxical. Now, in terms of history, Shanghai, as we know, was the most westernized Chinese city, but it's also birthplace of the CCP and the center of Maoist radicalism in the Cultural Revolution. I grew up during that period. And also presently, Shanghai is a frontier city of market reforms, opening up, and what Chinese call cosmopolitanism, which is all true. But it also the city is called by Chinese as a head of dragon in China's industrial policy and so-called state capitalism, which is really got a lot of criticism overseas. Now, finally, about the future. As we know that Shanghai could serve as the vanguard of the middle class worldly voices, views, and values, as I mentioned earlier on, as cosmopolitanism. But also, Shanghai has been the showcase, or will be the showcase of China's growing confidence, nationalism, and also mechanistic, global outreach, which also got a lot of resentment overseas. Now, my point here is that we should place Shanghai's future and China's future in an, kind of ever-changing domestic and international environment. It is not predetermined, not stagnant, certainly not fixed. Damien, over to you.
So there are some really interesting themes I want to come back to, but let's stick with Shanghai for just 1 second. You talked about the evolution of Shanghai is ever changing, and Shanghai has always had a exalted place or a unique status in China historically in the 1920s and even earlier than that. So could you take us through maybe in the last 30 years, what has really, there seem to be fairly dramatic changes for Shanghai, since the 1990s under the Jiang Zemin era. Maybe take our listeners through that period of change.
Sure. Indeed, as you said, I think understanding Shanghai is vital to understanding modern China. As you know, there's a famous Chinese saying. Actually, I use it as a quote in the book. Let me share with the audience. About that quote is quite revealing. To learn about the 2,000-year Chinese history, one should visit Xi'an. To understand the 500-year Middle Kingdom, one has to see Beijing. To grasp the past 100 years of changes in China, one must look at Shanghai. Now, also a distinguished American historian of Asia who actually taught at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, before you probably you studied there. His name is Rhodes Murphy. he wrote a book in 1953. The title is Shanghai, Key to Modern China. This tells you the importance of Shanghai to modern China. Now, as for the question, the recent 30 years, let me share with you my personal stories. Actually, both you and I were born in Shanghai, although you came as a very young boy. I came as a college graduate to study, attend graduate school, where certainly in a different age group and a different generation, I probably 2 generations ahead of you. And actually happened to be our native city. Now, in that city, I experienced both the dark era of Red Terror during the Cultural Revolution as a young boy, and also the happier and more promising times of Deng Xiaoping's economic reform in the opening up in the early 1980s as a college graduate, a college student. Now, in the middle 1990s, as you said, the Jiang Zemin era, I was privileged to live in Shanghai for 2 years as a research fellow with the support of the US-based Institute of Current World Affairs. The institute sponsored Doak Barnett went to China in 1949 on the eve of Communist Revolution, and also Dan Wright, who previously worked for Hank Paulson in the Treasury Department, the Economic and Strategic Dialogue. Also, he was sent in the 1990s, later 1990s, to Guizhou, where he spent 2 years. Now, so my assignment is to write about my Ripple Van Winkle experience in the city in the middle 1990s, that the middle class start to emerge. Now, this book on middle class Shanghai is not my first book on the subject, but actually the third book. In the middle 1990s, I wrote a book manuscript based on that experience, 2 years experience, field work in my above mentioned, field work. Now, but the book manuscript was largely, was rejected one after another by publishers, a total of 6 or 7, maybe 8. I can a lot. Now, the reason was largely the same. Reviewers did not agree with the overarching concept of the Chinese middle class. They believe that the concept of the middle class should involve civil society and the core middle class values. I will go back to this later on. Also, some reviewers commented that China consisted of only a rich and a corrupt official class and a vast number of poor people, with no such things called the Chinese middle class. Now, eventually, actually, I changed the book title to Rediscovering China, actually published, as a Rediscovering China, Dynamic and the Middle, Dynamic and Dilemmas of the Reform, and deleted most of the, explicit reference to the middle class. The book actually turned out to be a bestseller, widely used as a textbook in colleges in North America in later 1990s. My second book on the Chinese middle class was an edited volume. This is published about 12 years ago, and actually 11 years ago in 2010. This was the second book. The title is China's Emerging Middle Class, published by Brookings Press. Now, I published that that time, actually, Western business community was already fascinated about the economic implication of the rise of the Chinese middle class. That was the driving force at that time. Not academic, not government, but the Wall Street and the business communities in the United States and outside the world. Now, at that time, over 20% of the Chinese population concentrated in Shanghai and other major cities enjoy a middle-class lifestyle with private property, personal automobiles, improved healthcare, accumulation of the financial assets, and the ability to afford overseas travel and the foreign education for their children. Now, they live like middle class, consume like middle class, feel like middle class, and they were middle class. So they had already transformed China's socioeconomic structure and the world global economy. But interestingly enough, academic communities and the policy circles in the United States and in the West was still hesitant to accept that concept Chinese middle class. The 2010 book was actually one of the very few English books on the subject. Still now only probably 5 to 10 books use the middle class concept to analyze China. But in China, several hundred, maybe 1,000 books, what they call the middle income strata or middle class now frequently used. So now I also wanted to say, finally, I know that I want to move on for your other question, but I also want to say that the pervasive view in Washington today about the middle class development in China, however, is no longer one of hope for positive change, for peace and prosperity in the world, or mutual benefit for both countries, but rather one of fear that the development benefits only China and may even undermine American supremacy and security. Now, the dominant references to China nowadays in Western media are terms like Communist China, the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese virus, the failure of US-China engagement, economic decoupling, the clash of culture or clash of civilizations, and the whole of societal threat, and etc. So that's part of the reason. This also gives us some historical background, the evolution of the concept and our current, still why we tend to be cynical about that concept. But its concept itself, of course, from my perspective, is very, very important. Damien, back to you.
Well, so I got tons of questions that's gotten triggered by what you just said. But let's talk a little bit about the definitional, perhaps murkiness of the middle class. I know in your book, you say even the estimated size of the middle class is nobody knows. Some people say 300 million, some people say 500 million. I think McKinsey projects maybe up to 900 million in 10 years. So there's even debate over how big this constituency really is. So I guess in your judgment, in your view, how would you really define maybe not just the Shanghai middle class, but the Chinese middle class? I know they're diverse, but would it be primarily through income? Would it be primarily through property ownership? Would it be through attitude or just self-identification and the types of jobs they have? How would you grapple with kind of how to define the middle class?
Well, I will argue there's no a kind of single factor to define. It's a combination of the elements, I think. Now, let me also mention the middle class is an inherently flexible concept everywhere in the world. My study, like some other scholars in China and elsewhere, combines factors such as income, wealth, occupation, education, and social status to define this social economic group. It's not perfect. It has some flaws, I admit, but it's largely hold up some truism. Now, let me also mention some broader things that we should keep that in mind, although we may not know specific number, whether 300 million, 400 million. Chinese use the number is between 300 million to 400 million, but it's increased very, very quickly. Now, by 2019, 40 years after China began its economic reform, the national GDP had grown 60 times larger, and the per capita income 25 times higher. This number is less controversial, right? Now we are talking about China's threat. It's not because China's weakness, it's because of China's strengths, right? China emerges as a power, undermine American interest potentially, or already, right? I mean, I think with legitimate criticism and concern. Now, also GDP per capita has increased from about $1,000 in 2001 to 10,000. Or some, it's really 10,500 in 2020, last year. And it's expected to reach 30,000 by 2035, according to Chinese Lianghui, the March meeting, right? This is projection. Now, Shanghai by per capita GDP already exceeded $23,000 last year. So that's a number. Now, let me also mention, as for the status of Shanghai middle class, according to a 2018 study, over 5 million households in Shanghai share this lifestyle and could be considered middle-class families. Again, it's registered families, not immigrant families. Now, so that constitutes 91% of the total registered households of the city, 91%. And certainly not include the migrant workers and the family that could not, I mean, these families could not afford, decent rental housings. But according to a 2019 report by People's Bank, this is probably a well-known study that mainly published in Chinese, that the average value, of the household assets among Shanghai residents was already 1.2 million US dollars. I mean, think about this number. I mean, of course, there's a property bubble, but so far still not broken, in the past 20-some years or 30 years. Now, this certainly does not, again, include migrant workers and their families in the city. The economic disparity is a serious issue, but those 91% of the registered households in Shanghai enjoy the middle class, and also they have this kind of property. Now, in my book on China's middle class certainly focuses on Shanghai, but I also want to mention the book also documents the remarkable expansion of the middle class throughout the country. You mentioned about the McKinsey report, and it said that at that time 20 years ago, it's 40%. 10 years ago, it's 40% of middle class live in these 4 cities: Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. But according to Dominic Barton, the former head of the McKinsey, now is the Canadian ambassador to China. According to him, by 2022, next year, this 40% middle class live in coastal areas, these 4 cities will drop to only 16%. So at the same time, 60% of the Chinese middle class will live in 2nd tier or 3rd tier cities. So that's a remarkable expansion of the middle class. Now, I do not want to downplay the economic disparity, regional gap, and all kinds of things that I also study extensively. But this trend tell us the middle class development. I will be happy to talk about the occupational differences about the middle class if you want, and or your audience raise that question. But let me stop here.
Yeah, so China looks poised to have the world's biggest middle class, if not already basically have one of the largest middle class. And let's going back to what you said, in your previous remarks about the shifting prevailing view of the U.S. side toward China, especially kind of Beijing and the Chinese government. I think it's important then to kind of talk about what is sort of the Shanghai middle class's views and attitudes on the United States these days and previously. Because one of the things that I think I found really interesting is the chapter where you had the survey, the polls, and that I thought was quite interesting to kind of understand how the Shanghai middle class, or the middle class writ large, looked at the United States, even though the views from the U.S. clearly has shifted toward China. So
that's a good question. The survey only concentrate on a small number of samples by 2 different years. Early on, it's a few years ago, I conducted through Verizon, the survey company in China, and about concentrate on the foreign educated returnees. It's fascinating to see these people. On one hand, they are very cosmopolitan. They enjoy their experience in the United States. They really are very grateful for American schools. But at the same time, you do see some kind of rise of nationalism. And even that time, certainly if we compare with now, it's probably far more nationalistic. This is, we should understand the context when some people consider Chinese students are all spies because Chinese government weaponize them because their families still live in China. And so if your family still live in China, Communist Party just want you to steal the intellectual properties or do some intelligence work. I mean, how do these people will feel? You can imagine, right? And also when some people talk about that we should consider ban the entries of the Chinese Communist Party and their immediate family. We know, as you know, that there's 92 million Communist Party members. and also including their families, probably 300 million people. How do we know who belong to this 300 million? There's no way we know that kind of things. So basically, anyone from China will be suspicious. So of course, at the moment, it's still restriction, not complete ban. But that created what I call, what some people call 2020 version of Chinese Exclusion Act, the notorious one, right? But also that some politicians talk about China. I do not want to mention a particular person, talk about China has 5,000 years of cheating, 5,000 years of culture of cheating. How Chinese will feel that way? Now that's extreme views. When people talk about the clash of civilizations, so this time it's a unique US history. We're dealing with a competitor. It's not Caucasian. You know, that's a direct quote by some policymakers, the previous administration. Now, how you Chinese will not become nationalistic in that regard, right? Or even anti-American. That's a fact. That's a reality. That's the things that we should change. Because we have every reason these people should be pro-US. Actually, in many ways, they're cosmopolitan. In many ways, these people are pro-US, right? But just like some of us are very critical about our foreign policy, why they cannot, right? Now, there's a, early on I mentioned about the middle class is diverse now, but whether any coherent value they have, I do believe they have a coherent value, and some of the values may contradict to not in line with the Chinese authoritarian government. Some may be in line with, but let me list these values. You can say that you disagree, or yeah, or I welcome the audience comment. So I think these values, more or less, I will call the core middle class values or an attitude. Number one, appreciate the middle class lifestyle. Number two, protect the private property rights. Number three, support policies that promote education. Number four, advocate for measures that safeguard the environment. Number five, care deeply about the food and drug safety. A lot of protests related with that. Number six, resent the government's great firewall online. This kind of media censorship. I mean, many of them are intellectuals. Even those within the system, they are also very cynical about the media censorship, about the authoritarian government. And next few, demand government accountability and transparency. This is number seven. Number eight, look favorably toward economic liberalization, because Chinese middle class differ from American middle class. They benefit from economic liberalization since 1980s, but American middle class is shrinking. It's only small number of them, maybe even you can say the rich 20% of income people benefit. The other 80%, including vast majority of middle class America, do not benefit from economic liberalization. So that's a serious challenge to the United States. That's why President Biden wanted to renew middle class. America is the top priority. I think it's the right policy. But in China, even poor people benefit from the globalization. You can see all these five income groups increase. Of course, rich people increase much more, but the middle class did not exist before. And finally, they hold pride for China's rise on the world stage. Now, most of these concepts actually in line with American middle class. There's some cosmopolitanism, there's a civil rights need, there's a force for stability, and environment, food safety, drug safety, government accountability. These are all very, very important. Now, the question is about the US-China policy, but now we just think that all in the engagement benefit of China. I think it's too premature to say that, and also too premature to say that these middle class, they necessarily support authoritarianism or anti-democracy. Far too early, because middle class rise is a recent phenomenon. I think they may be still in the transitory phase of its development. Things could change. If you look at the protests over the past decade, largely by middle class, whether it be climate change, by Cai Jing, very quickly, her video.
The documentary that was
documentary, right?
That went viral. Yeah.
That's right. And also the the P2P platform. I think most importantly, it's probably Li Wenliang case. Just last February, a year ago, Li Wenliang case really touched the heart and mind of Chinese middle class. So they really think that the government, whether local government or central, we do not know for sure, but there's some problem. So there's a real sincere mourning about the Dr. Li Wenliang. So government eventually changed the policy. Excuse me. So you can see, and they treat at least officially consider Li Wenliang as a hero, right? And so this is talk about the middle class work. Now, of course, middle class, Chinese middle class, like American middle class, is also force for stability. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Because Chinese, to a certain extent, why they want stability? Because whether it be propaganda or it's real, they see that the two things really in their memories or their mind. Two things happened in the 1980s and maybe also early 90s. One is the Japan's economic decline after remarkable development and the stop. Then also the collapse of Soviet Union. They think these two things China should avoid, because you end up with, of course, there's some kind of conspiracy against the United States. This is a different matter. This is related with propaganda or with their understanding. With the current American rhetoric, also reinforce this kind of sentiment. But that explains their current position. But it's subject to change, right? Too early to say that. But the point is, my question is, if American alienate, our policymaker alienate the Chinese middle class, if we think the threat is a whole of society's threat, what's the leverage we have if we want to influence China's future, right?
Right.
Is that the U.S. interest to put all these people as enemy, to not make any distinction? Even I don't think American people will support that view, and also that our allies will think that's too much. So I think that we do need to rethink our approach, to be more sensitive, to understand the causes, the complicated causes of Chinese nationalism. I'm not defending Chinese government. There's a lot of things that China should improve. I certainly very critical about the human rights violation and etc. Right? But we should put all these things in a scale, try to understand rather than just simplistically jump to a conclusion, and that will undermine American interests, make our policy less effective.
So I want to just touch on a few things, and then we'll turn it over to the audience in Q&A. But when you said, the Chinese middle class, or at least the Shanghai middle class, it's obviously pretty diverse and it's hard to generalize. They, they sometimes prefer stability, which makes it sound like they're more going to be defenders of the status quo, but they also are not necessarily pleased by everything that the Chinese government does, and they're quite critical, and we know that in reality. So they could also be agents of change, socially and politically. So where do you see the balance for the middle class? Are they, on that balance, more going to be agents of change, or more sort of defenders of the status quo?
Well, I think we cannot predict in near future. If that U.S.-China relation continues to deteriorate, I'm leaning towards that they will maintain maintain status quo, even more support for authoritarian regime. But for long run, I do believe that all the values I mentioned will unfold in its own way. My general message is that the rise of China's middle class is still a relatively recent phenomenon. China's new middle class tends to emphasize the status quo at the moment, and also is risk averse in political views and behaviors. But this may be only a transitory phase. I think that if our policy continue this kind of decoupling, not engage, not to people relations that will hurt U.S. interests. Now, I think we should not underestimate the strong impact. My book is really talk about positive impact about the transformation of China due to educational and cultural exchanges in that area, in addition to economic changes. The book is about the higher education, avant-garde, legal profession, urban landscape, and many other things. And I do not want to go detail that, particularly the 2 chapters about avant-garde artists completely changed China's dynamic. There's also 1 chapter, a powerful chapter about China's legal development. As we know that the whole legal profession is the result of opening and with the outside world. I think the Ford Foundation, Henry Luce Foundation, we know that these people, they really contribute China's legal development, even without that, without the legal education and legal profession. Now there's a lot of Chinese work in China for the law firms. That's one study, one table show, one of the top 5 law firms. First of all, lawyers become no longer government officials. Some people work within system, some people work outside some system, some people become dissidents, right? It's a combination of them. But those who, a lot of them who currently work in the law firm, actually many of them they went to top school like Columbia University, Chicago, Michigan, Harvard, etc. These law schools. Many of them, a huge number of them, I think it's 80% passed the New York bars. So now they live in China, working in both foreign firms and Chinese firms. And for what? Of course, there's some hope in this kind of commercial law will eventually develop, right? So these are all the dynamics we should not overlook. And but one of the stories, the book has a lot of stories and the personal and based on individual. Besides this hard data, the one I think it's one of the most moving stories is that Kirby Bryant, he died in January 26 or 27, depending the Chinese time difference. It's the same time China's coronavirus hit the peak. Mm-hmm. But China's Weibo search, I think it's 1 billion hits on Kirby Bryant and the aircraft crash. This is 2 times more than the COVID-19 surge. And because Kirby Bryant is a great American ambassador, ambassador of public diplomacy, and his goodwill, his strong tie with China, and his daughter, who also, sadly passed away, could speak Chinese. Yep. So the Chinese really show their tribute to this great hero. And so that's the deep friendship and the result by educational, cultural, sports, people-to-people relations. But if we decouple, if we close the door, what we will face in the future? So that's just one of the many stories that I cover in the book.
Yeah, no, it's always struck me how popular Kobe Bryant is. I grew up in the Michael Jordan era, yes. But and here in Chicago, obviously, that's a huge deal. But Kobe has really, I think, has been the face of sort of NBA being globalized, really. So especially in the China market. So that was a really nice anecdote there. Let me just end maybe asking you a little bit more of a broad question. We talked a little bit about U.S. and China and how the dynamics have changed. And I've written how there's this assumption that somehow, Xi Jinping's China is the end of history for China. That's all, what you see is what you're going to get, without accounting for the dynamism and change that actually still happens, maybe gradually, but it's still there. So, whatever the size of the Chinese middle class, let's say it's 500 million people, 500 million and growing. If you're a U.S. policymaker, how do you account for that constituency? And, I know at the end of the book, you have some, prescriptions and ideas of sort of what, how should we think about this? How should we grapple with this ginormous, one of the world's biggest middle classes that's not just emerging, but have emerged. And maybe you want to talk through some of those, prescriptions and ideas.
Well, yeah, because of time, I could not elaborate because towards the end, as you said, in the final chapter, I had the 10 recommendations, 5 for Chinese, 5 for Americans, all centered around the middle class. And particularly, I think that basically the past Deng Xiaoping's reform period is largely to learn from the West, in many different ways, not just the economic things. Now, of course, Shanghai, as I mentioned, is a paradoxical. On the one hand, they learn about the market. There's the first stock market and the first land lease and the first, I mean, there are a lot of so many firsts in terms of foreign exchanges, right? And also Shanghai is the most dynamic in terms of foreign returnees and middle class, and also a lot of market reform. But at the same time, Shanghai is also a showcase of the Chinese state capitalism, this kind of industrial policy, indigenous development, right? Now try to compete with the United States. Both are true. This is what I call two tales of a city. So this dynamic, it's not end. The reality is that we should not just single one, emphasize one, because my book tried to provide a kind of humble view to contrast the current decoupling rhetoric or narrative, talk about failure of engagement. I say, wait a minute, it's not failure. So I'm so glad that the President Biden and his team emphasized middle class development. I think Jack Sullivan also contributed to the report released by Carnegie, and talk about the middle class development, talk about the actually American middle class want peace, right? Does not want to go back to Cold War. I think that's certainly it's a lesson. Now, your title for this talk is Lessons of the Chinese Middle Class. I don't think Chinese middle class want to have war. And also you can see the political mood, both you and I from Shanghai, maybe you're more leaning towards Beijing, I'm more leaning to Shanghai. I think the attitude is a little bit different. And again, I'm biased, you can know I come from Shanghai. But for example, that previously with the Taiwan crisis, the Strait crisis, the Shanghai leaders behave differently. They think, please, Taiwanese stay on, there's no war, don't worry, etc. So the message is quite different than other regions. I think that's very, very important as well. So we should look at all these aspects, but most importantly, to have a healthy competition, to emphasize commonality. These are the middle class similar in many ways like our middle class. Now, potentially can undermine American interests, but also can contribute to expand the middle class development, benefit from both sides, both market, the potential. But most importantly, it's a peace rather than war. That's a fundamental shared interest, right? So besides, there's still tremendous room to develop, to benefit from each other, from middle class, whether infrastructure development, whether trade, right? Now, we understand there's a necessary competition. The United States should protect about the national security. There's no question about that. But at the same time, there's certain areas you really cannot restrict. Now, your report about artificial intelligence certainly reveal that the 60% of the best talents live in the United States, but most of them from foreign countries. China in this area is not lag far behind. It's already too late. Probably should never happen. Because the nature, science, and should be shared by different nations, different peoples. You really cannot completely isolate. The policy you want to isolate to others, you probably end up with isolating yourself. So again, your report is so profoundly important about the artificial intelligence global distribution. So that's just an example. Mm-hmm. Life science, same things with COVID-19, with climate change. I mean, COVID-19 is not strong enough as a wake-up call. Do you want to have another disaster like climate change to wake up call that we are humanities? I mean, so the main point in my recommendation is the essence. We should not demonize other. So then we can find a common ground. So that's the fundamental things. I do not want to go into details, but that's the message that I want to share with the readers, with your audience.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right that there are going to be limits about how much we can slow China down. Absolutely. Versus just run faster ourselves.
Yes.
Which is sort of what we really need to be doing. So let's end here on a positive note. We have a number of questions that I'm going to get to for the next 15 minutes or so. Obviously, we covered a lot of ground. I'll just plug one more time. There's a lot of really interesting material in here. It's not just a case study about Shanghai. It's really about the future of the Chinese middle class and how to think about it, how to grapple with it. and really not to neglect probably one of the most important constituencies, not just in China, but probably globally speaking. So, please pick it up. And I think you'll see the link to the book in the chat. So Cheng, let me get to some questions here. Got a number of them. Let me see. Okay, the first one from, okay, so this is very timely. Obviously, we didn't touch on this, but China, of course, there's been a lot of coverage of the recent population census. And there's been, the announcement of China's moving to a 3-child policy rather than a 1-child policy. So the question here is, how do you think this more liberalization on the 3-child policy, how will that affect the Chinese middle class, or not really?
Well, this is a very good question. We certainly it's too early to address that, because usually we take, to see the result, to take 10 to 20 years to see the real effect. But the question is important. But there are several factors that are relevant. One is that the artificial, this kind of what's the artificial intelligence machine replacing human beings. We do not know how that affect the productivity and the labor force. Whether we do need laborers, or do need to have a huge market, and also China's size is so big. Whether we should certainly factor in all these things. The second thing is that the one-child policy is largely adopted in urban China. Urban China, even you have this free policy, probably people still do not want to have children. But the rural areas, even since 1978 or 79, China adopted the one-child policy. Rural areas still, most families are 2 children or 3 children family. So for this effect, we also do not know. But as overall, China realized the problem. I think that related to that problem is the one-child family. They now become adults. How they are kind of unique kind of characteristic affect people, and also that there's a lot of young people, one child, or maybe even from rural area, they went to college, because over the past 10 years or 15 years, China also have the higher education expansion. So the result is that now you have difficult to find a job, or some people come from the middle class or rich family, they do not want to work. So these are all the factors. We do not have reliable number, but I think it's worthwhile to focus on these things. Now, actually, that I'm also editing a book. It will come out by an author called Li Chunling. It's part of this Chinese Think series published by Brookings Institution. The title is China's Youth. She is a CAS scholar, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and a sociologist. The subtitle is Increasing Diversity and Persistent Inequality. So this is certainly touch the fundamental issues about the inequality, and this issue is related with the demographic question that you answered. But I'm sorry, I cannot answer directly, but I just mentioned several dimensions we should monitor very, very closely to see real impact. So at this point, I think we should certainly examine these issues, factor in all these relevant factors, and to see the social, political, economic, and the demographic impact.
Do you get the sense, let me just quickly follow up, do you get the sense that the Chinese government views this demographic shift to be more of a urgent crisis, or just something that they have to manage over the next 10 or 15 years?
I don't think they will put that at the top of priority or urgent matter, but it is the right move. And actually, social media, this is also a new phenomenon, immediately responded. You can see different kind of views. This has also caused a lot of confusions. And this is a relatively safe area to discuss. But there's all kinds of views, different views, sarcasm, and also some people that we cannot afford one child. How can they afford even 3 children? So this is related to a lot of policies. But I don't think the Chinese government think it's with the most sensitive issue area. But it's interesting, they address that one in such a prominent way and so relatively quickly. But I think this is a long-term challenge, middle or long-term challenge, not necessarily immediate challenge in my view. I could be wrong. The immediate challenge is one-child family members. It's particularly if they could not find a job, they rely on 啃老族, they rely on their parents, and they completely change China's social fabric, social structure. So what's the attitudes and also the gender imbalance itself is also another issue, right? More male than female. It could be 118 to 100, female. That's a serious social problem. So actually, that book will address these issues. I do not have time to expand, but that's the issue. I'm sorry that talking about the middle class. Also,
no problem. We only have
in 2 months.
Yeah, no, I mean, look forward to that's also a really important research area. So I have another question from Michael Buman, and this is on education because you mentioned one of the biggest, values for Chinese parents or for Chinese middle class is education. So this might be a bit of a niche question, but how do you think middle class parents in China view the recent regulations of extracurricular training schools in China?
There's a number of issues involved. There's a regulation for the right reason. There's a regulation probably it's not really constructive. Now, certainly there's so many extracurricular training schools or programs start to emerge by Chinese returnees and by foreign education institutions. I think most in general should be encouraged to diversify China's this kind of aspect. And also, I heard there's a Chinese public intellectual. He strongly criticized Chinese, put too much emphasis on, the academic education rather than like a sports, like this social responsibility. That's a kind of, particularly the leisure time and etc. So certainly China, this reflects China's problem. I think potentially it's very, very consequential. So in that regard, I think China should encourage this kind of extracurricular training and different level, particular. But at the same time, if it's become too excessive, particularly, that some of the kids, to study some kind of, academics early on, maybe even 3 years old, 4 years old, I think probably, this is not the right direction, but how to guide these kind of things, right? And so these are legitimate issue. But Michael, you're right. Basically, they emphasize education sometimes may have some unintended consequences, not always good. And I think that should have a for open discussion. And certainly Chinese education system differ profoundly with our liberal arts college education. So my view is we should continue to engage in foreign exchanges, but also at the same time, different views should be expressed. And I think that this is a big challenge, big issue for the future of China. If you think there's some weaknesses, this is an area I think China is quite weak, particularly for future generation healthy growth, right? China certainly has been doing very well in the academic, the mathematics Olympics and many other things. Is that the only thing China should emphasize? No, I think of course we can put more emphasis on academic training, academic education in the United States, but China should pay more attention to some extracurricular kind of education, social responsibility, and the sports, and again, all these kind of liberal arts components.
And I think in recent years, there's been a big rethink on this kind of, the Gaokao system. I think everyone starts to, criticize it. It just doesn't seem to be the way forward for a lot of, middle class elite parents. And they want a more well-rounded, education, which is also why I think the education market in China is huge. and it's going to continue to grow because there's going to be so many more diverse new services and offerings. So let me turn to one more question. Maybe we have time for two more, but this one from Alex Zhao. And his question is, in the Chinese political system, the middle class can't vote. They can't lobby to shape the political agenda. Instead, they're more constrained, they're more vulnerable, they're more of an economic status. So the question is, what channels can they go through? What can they do to kind of shape the political and social agenda? What are the ways in which they can, contest the state, so to speak?
Well, I agree. The basic observation of that question, certainly China does not have a democracy, the one person, one vote. But lobby, I do believe there's a lobby, but it's very subtle, different from the US, not registered and etc. But I think it's the main areas are from two. One is the urban area, kind of neighborhood communities for some causes, protect their rights. This rights consciousness is important development. Secondly, it's the social media. It's so powerful. Just to give you one thing, it's the webcasting. It's the phenomenon that did not exist a few years ago. But now that everyone could do that, usually by young people, very young people.
Yeah, the live stream culture.
That's right. This is a change in the public discourse, right? In a way that it's also dominated by urban area, dominated by middle class, right? So what's on their agenda, it becomes a dominant force. So government control is limited. I mean, this is why Chinese leaders, sometimes they say, I think that may not be wrong. They said that we have public opinion too. Now, sometimes the media censorship and media control had unintended consequences. The more you control this kind of social media, this kind of criticism have more market, right? So that becomes so powerful. So I think at this point, probably these two development, one is the neighborhood committee, this kind of movement, largely within the system or semi-within the system, play a very, very important role. And you cannot ignore whether it be by environment, children's rights, drug and food rights, climate change, and etc. Name it, right? Particularly by property, the rights protection, right? The other is the social media on various issues, sometimes could be political, right? So I think that at the moment, democracy is not in its moment. There's a lot of cynicism within China. But on the other hand, I think that for every system, that you do need to address the issue of the votes, representation, and peaceful transfer of power. These still will be with China, right? But of course, with middle class development, China Chinese leaders, I hope, will be less insecure about the protests and etc. Because this is a force for stability and not for necessary for destructive force. So I think that it will take time, and so this is the way that there's some positive development, but certainly it's not in the good moment in terms of democracy worldwide.
Okay, so we have time for just one final question, and I want to apologize for not getting to everyone's questions, but we just have a time constraint right now. So the last one, let's end on maybe more of a positive note as well. This one comes from Marshall Lee, and he asks, what impact can Chinese students studying in U.S. university have on U.S.-China relations, and also in, I think, building bridges between middle class of urban China?
It's China's educational exchange with outside world reached a peak over the past 10 years. Not only they came for college education, but also for high school or even younger education. This is completely different generation, different from my generation, also differ from Damien's Professor Ma's generation. And so these people are more confident about themselves, about their country. They certainly learn some things from the United States, and they probably will be more articulate, more understanding, I hope, about how outside the world look at China. And these people, they also are diverse a lot. will eventually overcome some of the lack of confidence and narrow-mindedness and or actual nationalism. So I'm actually more confident about that. And I found that their views are different, are diversified, just like the United States to a certain extent. I think this diversity will contribute the pluralistic future of China, will give the chance for people to be selective, to have a choice, to know what is right, what is wrong. And ultimately, I hope that they will also remember their time in the United States, the goodwill of American people. Sometimes it's because of misunderstanding. So that's why we should have more communication, more mutual understanding, which both, I think, the Policy Institute and Brookings, we try to achieve, but so far, certainly, it was a mixed result. But I think we still wanted to continue this kind of effort because we believe that education and cultural exchange ultimately is a positive force. It's too early to announce the failure of engagement.
Well, on that note, Cheng, I wanted to thank you so much for the conversation, but I want to make sure people, know the name of the book, Middle Class Shanghai. If you're going to read one book on middle class China, this is the book to get. It's like I said, it's one of the most important constituencies in the world because it will be one of the largest, and obviously it happens to be in the second largest economy in the world. So 500 million people need to understand it, and this is the book to read. And I want to thank you again for such a lively conversation, and look forward to all your future work, and hope we can catch up in person very soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cheng.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.